Thank you, everyone, for coming to the first lecture at the 4th annual Cannery Row Days. And I'm really honored to be here today. I have to say up front that I had a lot of fun putting this program together. And the fact that I had so much fun, I actually changed the title to it. And so it's now called A Good Time Was Had by All, the Sardine Story. And I'll connect all of this to our Ricketts Steinbeck story, I hope, at some point. But you have to bear with me. I will try to get there. But sardines played a very important role in Monterey history. Actually, it goes back a long time. Of course, here's our star of the show here, our sardine. And sardine really is kind of a generic word. Almost all small silvery fish are referred to as a sardine. But the catch in California along the west coast here, all the way down into South America, actually is known as a pilchard or the true sardine. And these guys are big. And Monterey eventually becomes the largest. This actually becomes the largest fishery of single fish in the history of the United States. They took an average of 234,000 tons of this little guy out of Monterey Bay every year between 1915 and 1950. Big, big fishery, all for a fish that actually nobody really wanted to eat, which I'll get into as we go along in this little talk here today. So I thought the best way is to actually back this up and really give a real little history about the sardine fishery in Monterey and California. So it really goes back a long time. I mean, it goes back literally thousands of years. So the first real sardine fishermen in Monterey were the native people, the Rumsen people. And we can trace the native culture into the Monterey area about 10,000 years. And I like to say they are the first real commercial fishermen in Monterey because that's truly how they made their living. They were fishing out in that bay. And sardines definitely played an important part of their life. We know that from middens and fish bones that are found in these old midden sites. And they would have fished them in boats like this. These are boats made out of tule, those big tall grasses, those reeds that grow along the wetlands out there. And they would use nets that they would make, sort of these drag nets that they would pull behind the boat, or they would, large schools, they would use baskets. They also would fish what they called beach seined nets, where they would actually take one of the net and row out from the beach and circle around a school of fish, bringing the line back to the beach. And everybody from the village then pull on the line, scooping in the fish and bringing them onto the beach. And there were obviously a lot of sardines out there, even in those guys' time, because we know they were bringing them in. And also, I should point out, during this time, after the Spanish had established a presence here and built the Carmel mission, the first real cannery in Monterey actually wasn't in Monterey, but in fact was in Carmel at the Carmel mission. So in the 18th century, after the mission was established, they were bringing fish into the Carmel mission, where they're putting it into barrels, where they fill the barrels with salt, and then they were shipping those down to Mexico City. They are canning them right down there in Mexico City. But here's one of the very first references I've ever found about fishing sardines in Monterey. This is actually come from a journal, the Kulibikov Archive. I know I mispronounced that. The Russians who had presence in California into the 18th century, Mr. Kulibikov here worked for a Russian company that was coming to Monterey between 1800 and 1837. He spent a lot of time here and kept a very active diary about his travels to Monterey. And as I was going through it, I ran across this reference. It said, Mr. Mariano wanted to have a herring sweet net, 60 hens long, sent next year to Monterey. I calculated that it would take 5 to 6 puds, that's a weight, of measurement, and 3 or 4 puds of tackle for sinkers, for a total of about 250 rubles. Quoted him a price of between 75 and 80 piastres, that's about $80 in today's money, or $80 in $1820, to which he agreed and requested the sweet net be made and sent without fail. Of course, they're using that net, and that's actually a pretty good sized net. They were using that net, again, to fish the abundance of sardines that were appearing in the Monterey Bay at that time. This is in the 1820s. And then I ran across this. This is a newspaper article appearing in the Monterey Sentinel, 1855. And it says, the sardines of Europe. We have advertised in the Sentinel to the great commercial value of the sardines of our coast. It appears that the Pacific sardine have a wide geographical distribution, being found in immense quantities from Oregon to Cape Horn. Now, this all, and at this time, and all the way up until the turn of the 20th century, and even beyond the turn of the 20th century, people in the United States ate a lot of sardines. They ate them like we would today eat potato chips or crackers. The sardines they were eating were not those big sardines, not those ones coming along the California coast, but those little guys, those guys you find in Europe, mainly coming from France. France was a big sardine producer at the turn of the 20th century. This is an advertisement for French sardines. And so what the Sentinel was doing is they were promoting Monterey, that perhaps we should open a sardine fishery here in Monterey. But they didn't have the infrastructure for that kind of thing. And there was nobody here that really wanted to develop a sardine fishery in the 1850s. So it took a few years before that even got established. But at least they were thinking about it at that time. But the French were really involved in it. And also on the East Coast, they were fishing sardines along the Atlantic at that time. Then in 1880, Hotel Del Monte opened its doors. This hotel, by the way, was the fanciest hotel in the world at its time. And by the way, this hotel was built in 3 months. It opened in June of 1880. And what this hotel really was, what they would call a winter hotel. Marcus tells us rich folks lived in Boston and Philadelphia and New York. Hey, got all those cold winters. Come to Monterey. Spend a couple of months at the Hotel Del Monte. A lot of folks would do that. Got all these folks coming to stay in your hotel. Well, you're going to have stuff for them to do. So they created that 17-mile drive, which, by the way, was never actually 17 miles. Now, all kinds of beautiful gardens and games, and eventually had golf and polo, and they had sport fishing out in the Monterey Bay. But the hotel would work with the local commercial fishermen who, no pun intended, will hook themselves up with the sport fishermen that are coming to the Hotel Del Monte, and they would take them out in the bay in their little boats and show them the good place to fish for salmon out in the bay. They were fishing guides like they would do in Europe. By the way, this wonderful drawing of the Hotel Del Monte, you can see the hotel here. And I'm sure all of you know the hotel is where the Naval Postgraduate School is today. But here is the Southern Pacific Railroad coming into Monterey here. And then you can see the hotel's bathhouse here and their own little wharf that they had here. And then you can see Monterey. Here's the train station for Monterey and all the rest all over in here. So one of those sport fishermen who had come to stay in Monterey was this gentleman right here. This is a guy named J. Parker Whitney. And Mr. Whitney and his two brothers came to California during the California gold rush and made a lot of money. Not in finding gold, but in selling supplies to those gold miners. They also began to breed sheep. They didn't like the wool that the California sheep were producing. So they took a sheep they purchased in Hollister and crossbred it with a sheep they brought in from Australia. And they began to produce a really high quality wool. And so they made a lot of money selling this wool. So the time Mr. Whitney was in his early 30s, he was a very wealthy man. And he spent the rest of his life traveling the world, doing the things that he loved, which was hunting and fishing. He spent a lot of time coming to Monterey, staying at that Hotel Del Monte, and fishing salmon out in the bay out there. He is the guy actually introduced the idea of fishing salmon in the bay with a rod and reel. Here it is right here. And also fishing salmon with a trolling line, which is a line with a lot of hooks on it, which you drag through the bay, which is a really effective way to catch salmon out in that bay out there. In those early days, all the Monterey commercial fishermen used to fish salmon with hand lines. It was very difficult. Sometimes they would use gill nets, which really wasn't all that effective. And so they said, hey, we can fish salmon that way. And so they switched their fishing technologies. And you can see it in the records. In 1893, they caught maybe 5,000 pounds worth of salmon. Then in 1895, thanks to Mr. Whitney's ideas, they switched to they were fishing salmon with these trolling lines. They caught over 95,000 pounds of the salmon out in that Monterey Bay out there. And this is a Hotel Del Monte mailer. They used to send out to all the hotel sport fishermen had come to the hotel and stayed at the hotel previously. I love this mailer. So you can see the boat here. Here is our commercial fisherman here, our fishing guide. And here is our sport fisherman here. You'll notice that he's wearing a suit. Then the other side it says, "Dear sir, look at our result of fishing on Monterey Bay and Pebble Beach today was." And they have listed all these different things they were catching out in the bay: salmon, sea trout, I'm not sure what that was, sea bass, tuna, rock cod, barracuda, yellowtail. These are mostly tuna, barracuda, yellowtail. These are really warm water fishes, are not normally found in Monterey Bay, which tells me there was probably an El Nino going on at that time. But really is important about this little mailer is this little drawing down here of a fishing salmon rig that was designed by J. Parker Whitney. And it really sort of revolutionized where they were fishing salmon out in the bay out there. And actually what it was is that once the salmon got cut under the hook, the weight would drop off from the line, enabling the lightening the line and helping the fish, bringing the salmon back onto the boat there. So around that same time, there were a group of Japanese fishermen arriving into the Monterey Bay. The Japanese arriving here in the late 1890s. It was really a guy named Otto Sabaru Noda, who was the first to really recognize the importance and the abundance of Monterey Bay. And began to bring fishermen from Japan, mainly to fish for abalone and to fish for salmon. Salmon was king. Salmon was a big fishery in Monterey and California at this time. This is a Japanese salmon fisherman. This is a wonderful photograph on his brand new salmon boat. This is taken about 1916 at the Monterey Boat Works. But I love this photograph. But to give you an idea, and here is another Japanese fisherman, salmon fisherman out in the bay. This is the Ohio, not the state of Ohio, but in Japanese, that means good morning in Japan. This actually is the Baraka family. But to give you an idea of how important this was or how big this fishery was, in the end of the 1909 salmon season, about when this photograph was taken, the Monterey Daily Cypress, which was the local newspaper at that time, reported at the end of the 1909 salmon season, there were 185 salmon boats working the Monterey Bay. 145 of them were Japanese owned, catching an average of 1 million pounds of king salmon in 3 months. 1 million. The 1909 salmon season, they caught 1,500,000 pounds worth of king salmon. 1910, they caught 2 million pounds of king salmon in Monterey Bay. I mean, that is a lot of fish. What were they doing to all that salmon? They were put in boxes like this. You can see the size of these fish and those boxes. These pictures, by the way, were taken also in 1909. They were boxed here in Monterey, taken by horse and buggy to the train station, then get ready to load them onto the train, where they're then shipped up into the San Francisco Bay Area, where they're kind of pickled. And they were then sent to Europe, going mainly to Germany. And about 90% of it went to Germany. That's where the market was. That's where all the money was. And as I mentioned earlier, all the sardines that people were eating at this time were coming from Europe, coming primarily from France. That particular 1909 salmon season was so big and so great that all the fishermen actually held a party. And here, this is a boat parade. You can see the band on the back of that boat. They had fireworks and everything was decorated with Japanese lanterns. And all people in Monterey came down to the wharf to watch the boats, and they had all kinds of foods and all kinds of things at this 1909 party, which is a tradition that seems to continue throughout Monterey's history, which I will talk about later in this little talk here. So all the salmon landing gets the attention of a guy named Frank Booth. Frank Booth was in the salmon business up along the Sacramento River in the late 19th century. At that time, up there in Northern California, that's where all the salmon processors really were. But they weren't doing very well at that time. They weren't catching a lot of salmon. There was a depression going on in this country. So all the salmon processors formed this little co-op called the Sacramento River Packers Association and heard the big landings going on in Monterey and sent Mr. Booth down there to check it out. He comes down here and goes, "Oh, man, this is great." Try to get contracts with the Japanese fishermen. They said, we already got good contracts with the markets in San Francisco. So he backs off a little bit and builds this little shed right behind where Heritage Harbor is today, and begins to experiment with these large sardines that are appearing in the bay at the end of the salmon season. And between that time, the city of Monterey actually leases this very piece of property we're looking at right here to a man named H.R. Robbins. This is right adjacent to the Monterey Wharf today. And I've seen Mr. Robbins' lease, and it says on his lease, for the purposes of sardine cannery, reduction plant, dance hall. Needs to say that Mr. Robbins is not the greatest businessman, and Booth bought him out in 1905, took over that cannery, got the contracts with Japanese fishermen, began to can salmon in his cannery, or really began to box it, and then began to fish sardine as a small secondary fishery in between the salmon season. So he needed sardine fishermen because most of the Japanese were leaving Monterey at the end of that salmon season to go work in the ag fields in the Central Valley of California, only to return in the spring to fish salmon. And also, as I'm sure you're all aware, at the turn of the 20th century, there's a lot of anti-Japanese sentiment in the United States, coming primarily from white workers who are convinced the Japanese are coming to take their job, which really wasn't the case. And at that time, about 1905, Mr. Booth says to the local newspaper, "I'm not going to hire any more Japanese." Easy call for him because he didn't really mean it. You're still going to buy salmon from him. He turned into spring. And he also had Japanese workers already working in his cannery. But that instant, he sent for the Sicilian fishermen who already worked for him up along the Sacramento River, fishing salmon, to come down here to Monterey to start fishing sardines here as that secondary fishery. This is a Sicilian fisherman with his 3 daughters on his brand new Lampara boat. This refers to the type of netting that he used. Very proud. This is a wonderful photograph. This is taken on where the small craft harbor is today when it was a beach. You can see the wharf here. This is the Southern Pacific Railroad wharf right there that you see right there. So when those guys first arrived here, these guys were not schooling fish fishermen. They weren't sure how to do it. But they remembered when they lived in Sicily, they'd sail across the bay in Sicily into Tangiers where these African fishermen did fish schooling fish like sardine and anchovy, and they used a special type of net for that. So somebody here in Monterey writes letter back to Sicily, said, "Go and get us that net, send it to Monterey," which they did. They built it on the port of the custom house. They called it a lampara, which means lightning in Sicilian because it was fast, and began to fish sardine in the Monterey Bay. This picture was taken very close to the harbor. This is, by the way, a seaside behind it right there. You can see all these Sicilian fishermen fishing sardine. You can see fish in the net right here. This boat says Crescent. This is the Booth Cannery. That was the name of the Crescent brand sardine. That was his boat. This gentleman here, this is Pietro Ferrante. He is responsible for all these Sicilian fishermen coming here to Monterey. Well, a good captain like Pietro Ferrante here knows that if you take care of your crew, then your crew will take care of you. So look, this is what they would use to float their nets. They would use lead weights on the bottom, these glass floats at the top. They'd use these bottles. Got a rounded bottom on the bottom here because in those days, you put a carbonated beverage in the bottle and it's upright, the carbonation would pop the cork. But it's on its side, they didn't have that problem. Who'd use these bottles, they'd fill these bottles with beer, use them to float their nets in the cold water of the Monterey Bay. They're done fishing, pull off the floats, everybody had cold beer. Pretty smart. So the first real cannery was present-day Cannery Row, was this cannery, Monterey Fishing Canning Company. This was a Japanese-owned cannery. It was our friend Otto Sabaru Noda, the gentleman who actually brought all the Japanese fishing to Monterey. In 1902, he opened his cannery. And if you know Cannery Road today, there's a big empty lot right next to the El Chorrito restaurant that they hope someday to be some kind of marketplace there. That's supposedly supposed to have a museum there at some time. I don't think that's going to happen in my lifetime, but they keep talking about it. He built the cannery there. Oh, I went the wrong way, sorry. He built the cannery there in 1902. Only operated for about 5 years, closed in 1907. And this is a label for his cannery. He did have an American partner, again, Harry Malpas was his partner. And they canned sardines, and they would call it a true sardine. And they also, which is a big sardine, and then they also canned abalone in that cannery there. This cannery, this is a photograph about where the cannery was. In the early days, everything was done by hand. The boat, the fish you pull off the come off the boats in these big baskets. They walk up behind the cannery, lay on these racks to dry, and walk into the cannery to the point where everything was all hand, all hand done, put into the cans, to the point where they're actually hand soldering every can. It was a very, very slow process. Eventually, a guy named Newt Hogan, who came to work for Effie Booth, who came and introduced the idea of big commercial dryers and sealing machines, and really revolutionized and sped up that whole fishery. Eventually, Mr. Hogan opened his own cannery on the end of Cannery Road, which is today where the Monterey Bay Aquarium is today. So here's the first national ad for Monterey sardines. Appears in a Sears and Roebuck catalog in 1905, being advertised in there as souse. Those are pickling spices, broiled mackerel. So he's advertised these sardines as Monterey mackerel. And he thought they were too big. No one buying this sardine. But even in 1905, the federal government said, you cannot call those mackerel because they're not mackerel, those sardines. They marketed these fish initially to the African-American communities as salmon sardines, and they marketed them to the Jewish communities as herring sardines. They tried a variety of things to sell this product. They used to produce these beautiful recipe books like this one right here. And you go down to the cannery, they'd give you one, or oftentimes you bought canned products a day, you bought it by the case, they'll put one in the case. So all these great recipes for sardine sandwiches and sardine rarebits and sardine salads. My favorite, though, was a sardine jello salad that you made with lime jello, chili sauce, and Monterey sardines, which I have to say I've made a few times. Not that bad. Of course, what happens? War happens. War changes a lot of things. When the war broke out in Europe, of course, it cut off all that salmon going to Europe, all those sardines coming from Europe, and they just switched, began to heavily fish sardine along the West Coast here. We're sardine cannons, New York State and Maine. Those guys couldn't fish because there were German submarines out there in the Atlantic. So there was a big demand for sardines, so they began to heavily fish them along the West Coast here. And there was a push to start building canneries along the waterfront. In fact, blueprints are drawn up, plans are being made to build canneries all the way along the waterfront, starting about where wharf number 2 is today, all the way along that area there. But the folks at the Hotel Del Monte were very, very unhappy with this idea. And they had a lot of economic power in Monterey at that time. And they did not want this fish to even develop because they were concerned if you got sardine canneries along the waterfront, then the tourists wouldn't come to Monterey. And so they passed all these petitions around trying to stop this fish from even developing. But the city of Monterey said, wait a minute, there's money to be made here. They said, all right, all you sardine processors go way down there at the end of Ocean View Avenue where nobody goes. And that's how Cannery Row becomes Cannery Row. And Mr. Booth could stay where he was because his cannery is already there. So Booth's Cannery actually is the only cannery actually in Monterey proper. This is one of the ads that he produced about 1916. In peace or war, you can always count on Booth sardines. But still, it was the market wasn't local. It was still a tough market. People on the East Coast, people in the Midwest who were buying sardines didn't like them. They thought they were just kind of big and oily. So looking for ways to really expand this market. And what happens? The World's Fair comes to San Francisco. In 1915, they had the Panama Pacific International Exposition, which was a huge World's Fair. And World's Fairs were big deals in those days. This was a World's Fair that they opened to honor the opening of the Panama Canal. It opened just a few years before. And if you know San Francisco, they built this World's Fair where the Palace of Fine Arts is. In fact, that Palace of Fine Arts was built for this World's Fair. It was all in this big mud flat. They filled it all in. It was about 600 acres. And all kinds of new products introduced to this World's Fair, all kinds of cars and motorcycles and bicycles and typewriters and telephones and the Liberty Bell who came to the World's Fair. Every state was represented. It was a very big deal. And this is a business card that I found years ago on eBay. there was a time when I was the curator at the Monterey Maritime Museum. eBay was the museum curator's best friend. You could find all kinds of things on eBay, things you thought you would never see. And I saw this business card on eBay, and this is probably about 30 years ago. And I'd never seen a Booth business card, but I could see there was some writing on it. But on my computer, then I couldn't read what it said. But I never saw the card, so I bid on it, and I won it. And I was very happy to get the card. And when I got it, then I could read what it said, and it says, near U.S. Fisheries Food Products Building Exposition. This is from that World's Fair. This is where Monterey sardines were introduced to the world, right there on that little business card, right there. So here's another photograph of that World's Fair. This is the Food Exposition Building, and evidently there was a couple that got engaged and then got married at the World's Fair. And so all the businesses that were exhibiting in the food product building gave gifts to the wedding couple. You can see all these beautiful Holton malted milk, and there's the sun-made raisins, and there's flour over here. Here's some gum, and here's a photograph that you can see of the World's Fair. There's the Palace of Fine Art you see right there. And then you see right down there, Crescent brand sardines right there. And of course, here's bottles of beer. Beer and sardines go together, right? So Mr. Booth produced this label, a real treat, Booth Broiled Sardine, delicious, served with beer. And I'm sure that's absolutely true. Of course, as I mentioned, the sardine, Monterey, California sardine, never was a popular fish to eat. It never was. The real money was never at any point in its history in the canned product. The real money was always in the byproducts. Now, I should say that during the Depression, it was a cheap food source and people did buy it, but the money always was in the byproduct. And the canners really, really worked hard to produce this fish meal, an animal fertilizer, that kind of thing. The real money was really in chicken feed. That's where the real money was in this business. Next time you guys go to the market, you buy a chicken for your dinner, you can thank the Monterey sardine for that chicken. Because prior to 1920, the chicken industry in California was not doing very well. People did not eat chicken like we do today. You know, it was kind of expensive. They began to produce the cheap chicken feed out of the head, tails, and offal, the guts of the Monterey sardine. The chickens loved it, thrived on it. More and more chickens being produced. The price of chicken went down. People began to buy chicken. My friend Bill Ripley, who was a retired biologist, used to say, the Foster Farm chicken owes its life to the bones of the Monterey sardine. Absolutely true. But of course, this is a label for Booth chicken feed, the sardine you get right there. So there's a wonderful picture as a fish that is really beginning to develop. This was taken about 1910. Right along the Monterey waterfront. Again, here is where this wharf you see here is the Southern Pacific Railroad wharf. Now where wharf number 2 is. This was also referred to in those days as the Japanese wharf because many Japanese fishermen would tie up their boats at this wharf. You can see all the nets on the racks here that are drying. These are mostly Japanese nets. This is a Japanese fisherman right here. Then the wooden boardwalk you see right here. This wonderful wooden boardwalk was put in by the Hotel Del Monte when they built the hotel in 1880. They built this wonderful wooden boardwalk that wrapped its way all the way along the waterfront from the hotel all the way to the Monterey Wharf. In those days, in the early days, in the 1880s, 1890s, the wharf was really a tourist-oriented wharf, and you go down there and glass bottom boat rides, and they had beach pavilions and fish markets and that kind of thing. No restaurants then. And as the sardine fishery begins to develop, it turns into more of a working man's wharf. And then after the fishery collapses, it goes back to that tourist wharf that we see it today. So as the fishery grows, the boats get a little bigger. This is actually a sardine lighter. So the fish didn't go under the boats, but they pulled a barge behind them called a lighter. This is one of those lighters. This is a small one unloading its sardines at the Booth Cannery you see right there. And this could probably hold about 20 tons of sardines in that little barge right there. And by the way, in the early days, sardines were fished in the daytime. And the fish would go out and they said they would listen for this flip in the water that schooling fish would make. And then they learned that sardines are nocturnal and feed off this little phosphorescent animal. Began to fish sardine at night when the moon is at its darkest. They go out and look for this milky glow that could be an acre in size out there. And they would be fishing all night, fishing sardine. So in the early days, it turned the 20th century, at the beginning of the sardine fishery, the boat owners were unionized from the jump, from the very beginning. The crewmen were not. And beginning about 1920, it became sort of an annual event for the boat owners to go out on strike for higher prices for their fish. Because what they would do is they would contract to a particular cannery every year, and then you would negotiate the prices per ton every year. And they would go on strike almost annually. It was an annual thing. Well, if your boat owner was out on strike, then you weren't fishing. You weren't fishing, you weren't making any money. You weren't making any money, you couldn't pay your rent, you couldn't feed your family. After a particularly long strike in 1925, all these crewmen, in fact, the strike went on for about 6 weeks, all these crewmen formed their own union. In fact, you can see on November 27th, 1925, they formed the Monterey Fishermen's Protective Union. Then on November 28th, 1925, they're all fired by the boat owners. We don't need you, they said. We're going to bring in these new sardine boats, these purse seiners. We don't need you. We don't need as many of you guys. And Newt Hogan's Cannery said, well, I'll just send out my cannery workers. Anybody go on that bay and fish sardines. Well, after about 6 weeks of seasick cannery workers, those crewmen had their own union. This banner, by the way, still exists today. And although it's not an exhibit anywhere right now, but it will be soon. So here's a wonderful picture of fishermen, and we can see the barge right here. That barge is filled with sardine. You can see, I mean, he's pulling it in up to the wharf before it sinks. So again, as technology grows, the boats get bigger. This is a Lampara boat here, and then you can see the barge, how much bigger the barge has gotten. This barge can carry 60 tons of sardine right here. And you're unloading with these baskets right here. These baskets don't take that much fish. It's going to take a very, very long time to unload this barge right here. And by the way, these Lampara boats you see here, there are usually 14 guys in a crew. And there's no radios on these boats. There's no depth finders on these boats. The most technology on this boat, these guys will take a piece of steel. They'll put some lard or butter on the end of that piece of steel, tie a rope around it. They'll drop it into the bay. They'll pull it back up, and there's sand stuck on the end of that piece of steel. They know that the bottom isn't rocky, and they can lay out their net with it that way. So here are those barges here unloading at one of the canneries because you couldn't bring the boats in close to the canneries. They'd bring these barges in, and then they would drop these buckets down to the lighter, to the barge, and then unload the fish. Now, again, these barges are carrying 60 tons. These barges carry about 600 pounds. So going back and forth, it's going to take a very long time to unload these barges. So in 1926, Newt Hogan's Cannery had seen these hoppers working out in agricultural fields out in Central Valley, California. Right in the middle of those fields, they had these big wooden boxes, these big hoppers. They dump all the fruits and vegetables in the boxes in these hoppers. Then they go by conveyor belt into the canneries. We figured, why can't they work out in the bay? So he had his engineers design these systems that work with the marine pump and the boats that come up to the hopper. And this is actually one of those hoppers right here. Come up to the hopper, they dump their fish into the hopper and works with the marine pump. And then they would take up to 60 tons an hour. It would suck the fish right into the cannery. These hoppers could take up to 60 tons an hour, and it would scale the fish as they went through it. Every cannery, at least one, some of them had two of them. So this is a wonderful photograph. This is taken in 1930. This is Monterey's past, present, and future in the fishing industry, 1930, all in this one photograph right here. So this is one of those Lampara boats you see right here. Here is what's known as a half ringer or Japanese round haul, also referring to the type of netting that it used. Here is a purse seiner. You see right here without the turntables. And here's two brand new purse seiners with the turntables. And on the turntable, you pile your net onto the turntable. And when you're out in the bay fishing, you see a school of fish, then you drop this big skiff under the water, takes the front end of that net, and the skiff rowing will go clockwise around that school of fish. Then the big boat will go counterclockwise around it, encircling that school of fish. These nets could be 1,500 feet in circumference. 1930, that net's going to cost $15,000 or so. Very expensive net right there. So in Southern California, I've been told these turntables will turn to the right. In Monterey, they turn to the left. I like to think that's a political thing. So fish like sardine and other schooling fish tend to swim together. It became a problem here in Monterey. It was not uncommon for Monterey sardine fishermen to catch a net full of anchovies. Anchovies were problems for these sardine fishermen for a number of reasons. One of the reasons was those anchovies were smaller, that caught in the mesh of the net. Also, that those nets are made out of cotton, and the anchovy will secrete this mucus that will destroy that net rather quickly. And so they have to rush into Monterey. They have to dump the sardines, or the net, with the anchovies into a big vat of hot water. They have to treat the net into this tannic solution that comes from the bark of a tan oak tree. They would treat them in these big vats to protect it. They had to do that all the time. But if they're out in the bay, it could take a long time to bring your boat in. And so the Rappa family, who ran the big tanning vats on the wharf, for early on had this idea that maybe they could come up with this barge system and have a portable tanning system. And this is a picture of it here, where a boat brought up a net full of anchovies. They would radio ahead to the Rappa family business, and they would rush the barge out to meet them. And by the way, you note the anchor on the wharf right here, which is old anchor. I just noticed this, and they could bring that anchor. They probably caught one of those nets and then brought in. But they would rush this barge out, meet the fishermen in the bay, and then they would dump it into the hot water and treat it again in that tannic solution to protect the cotting netting. But this didn't last very long. It just wasn't very efficient for them to do that. By the way, you can see here, this is another net full of anchovies. And the fishermen referred to this as a Christmas tree. So I asked an old fisherman why they called it the Christmas tree. And he told me that they were catching a lot of anchovies in the 1930s around Christmas time. And when they pulled the net up like this, it kind of looked like a Christmas tree, especially when it was all these silvery anchovies inside, and in the sun, they would sort of reflect like Christmas lights, so hence the name Christmas tree. So as the cannery, the demand for the fish during the Depression began to grow, and the fish products began to grow. Workers began to be needed in the canneries, and here are a group of cannery workers lined up to get work in the canneries. I love this photograph you see here. You see the woman here in her uniform. Only the women had to wear uniforms, and not always. Actually, uniforms are really sort of early on. They proved not to be very efficient, very practical, really. So only a few canneries operated with uniforms. But the men didn't have to wear uniforms. So inside the canneries here, and if you lived in Monterey in the 1930s, you had some connection to these canneries. Either you worked in them, you knew somebody that did, or you had some kind of business, or you worked in some other kind of business that had a connection to these canneries. A restaurant, grocery store, all had connection to these canneries here. This is a group of mostly Asian workers in the San Xavier cannery. These are fish cutters you see right here, and mostly Asian, a lot of Asian fish cutters, because they had those particular skills. Early on, it was all done by hand. Eventually, machinery was brought in to do that kind of work and really was efficient. I love the guy's tattoo you see right there. So these are female workers in the canneries. The majority of the labor force in these canneries were women. They had the heart of the jobs in these canneries, and they made about 15 cents an hour less than the men did. These ladies are canning sardines right here. Prior to World War II, you would never see a man doing this. This was considered to be women's work. Also, this was piecework. They got paid by how many cans they put up in an hour. And this, you see the little card you see on the line right here. Usually, oftentimes, you see cards that are on their backs right here. Then once an hour, the forelady, that's the lady in charge of all the female workers, will go down that line and mark those cards as to how many cans they put up in an hour. So this lady's making 16 cents for every It's 20 so cans that she puts up in an hour. So it's very low pay to do all that kind of work. And you're working 10, 12 hours a day. I mean, sardines were fished at night. So but boats would come in at 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning. Every cannery had its own method to get us workers to the canneries. Most of the workers lived up above Cannery Row, so they all had whistles. Unfortunately, and each had its own particular tone. But unfortunately, nobody wrote them down, so we don't know what they all were. But as soon as you heard that your canner's whistle, you drop whatever you're doing, and usually you'd be sleeping, and you go down the hill to go to work. And if you had small children, hope you had an elderly parent or a neighbor that didn't work in the canneries. Otherwise, your kids would fend for themselves. There are some canneries actually had what they call the phone tree, and they would call you. And I met a woman who came to Monterey in about 1934, and she was a school teacher, and she lived in New Monterey. And in those days, your phone number didn't move with you, but was assigned to a house. When she first moved to her house, she'd get these phone calls every morning about 3 or 4 o'clock, and she'd pick up the phone, and all she'd hear on the other end is fish. Well, she thought one of her students playing a trick on her. Then she finds out later on, no, that was the cannery calling her to tell her the boats had come in, get down to the cannery. So the man did things like this. This is a guy working, cooking all the sardines. So sardines, once they were canned, then they would be cooked. There was a 2-step process. So before they put the lids on the can, they would pre-cook them for about 30 minutes. And then they would drain them and then put the lids on them and seal them and put them in these big baskets called retort baskets and cook them in these big cookers called retorts. They cook under a low pressure, about 240 degrees for an hour and a half. In theory, they'll last forever that way, right? So this is an ad for the Hovind Cannery. Of course, they promoted the fact they're all white packers. We shall indulge in a digression here and to comment upon the unusual makeup of the Hovind packing staff. The plant employs only white help and has the best of these. Observer is impressed with the neat appearance of the women and with the fact that they all wear caps and smocks or clean new aprons while at work. 36 to 40 of them line the sides of the 3 tables, each being watched over by an inspector. The entire crew works beneath the direction of Mrs. Wyatt, a most agreeable, efficient woman who has had wide experience as a supervisor in food canneries. But I have to tell you, they weren't all just white women. There were a number of cultural Asian women. There were a number of Hispanic women and men working in these canneries at that time. So the unions didn't come into the canneries until 1938. This is a time card for a worker by the name of Dorothy Wheeler. Before there was a union, and I knew Dorothy. She worked at Hovind's Cannery, and you can see down here that they wrote 8 hours, 6 days a week. Now, number one, we know that she worked more than 8 hours a day. She didn't go home till they pull all the fish in because there was no refrigeration in those canneries until the 1950s. So we know she worked on 10, 12 hours a day. In fact, my grandmother worked in these canneries, and she told me some days would be so tired that they would have to get taken home by an ambulance because they'd go to work from one cannery and go to the street and work in another cannery when they were all done to help them get their fish put up. Let's take a look at a close-up of the time card here. So look, we can see now that she also worked a 6th day, and then they erased it because it was illegal even then for them to work 6 days or more than 40 hours. And she also made about $19.22 for that work week that she put in there. The unions finally came in 1938. It was AFL that came in and unionized these workers. And then in 1939, the CIO, which was then a separate union, then considered to be a kind of radical union, kind of been thought to be a communist union. They came in and tried to unionize a lot of the workers here. They offered them better pay, they get them better working conditions, and a lot of workers signed up for them. But the can owners said, forget it. We already dealt with the AFL. We're not dealing with that communist CIO. They said anybody who signs up with the CIO are not allowed to work in the Monterey Sardine Canneries for the 1939-40 season. And they weren't. 2 weeks before Christmas, 1939, those CIO workers sent their children on a strike. And here they are. These are all these kids marching from downtown Monterey to Cannery Row, and they're carrying this sign. The sign actually says, Santa Claus can't come to my house because Daddy works for the CIO. Eventually, unions merged, and they all had one. Of course, after work, you would have a little downtime, and there they are recreating in the warehouse right there. This is a wonderful union book for a Japanese worker, Mr. Sato. So once a month, you paid your dues. A union rep would come in and actually stamp the card, stamp the book that you worked in, and that you paid your dues that month. So you can see he always paid his dues, and then you see he's withdrew from his union in March of 1941. The reason he withdrew because he got drafted into the Army, March of 1941. This is before the United States entered World War II. Just a few months before. Actually, we entered the war in December of 1941. And Mr. Sato actually became part of the 442nd, which was an all-Japanese crew, all Japanese service. It was the most heavily decorated unit in the entire military service during World War II. And they were all throughout Europe. And then you can see it's all blank all the way back until October 26, 1945, when Sato came back to the cannery, right straight back to work. So it's empty for 4 years, right back to work again. But there was a huge demand for workers to work back in the canneries back then. So I have to tell you that Ed Ricketts was not the only scientist on Cannery Row, nor his most important scientist on Cannery Row. These guys were right here. These are the biologists for the California Department of Fish and Game, right here, circa about 1930, right here. This woman named Frances Clark, you see right here, this is a guy named W.L. Schofield and M.J. Croker, and this is a Mr. Linder, and this is J.D. Phillips, you see right here, who actually was a guy stationed in Monterey. And here is Frances Clark. Frances Clark was a woman way ahead of her time. This is Women's History Month. Frances Clark is the first person first person within Fish and Game to receive a PhD, which she got in 1925. So they weren't sure what to do with her. They said, well, let's make her the librarian. She took a series of books and sat on Ann's desk and built into one of the premier fisheries libraries in the world, which a big part of it is now here in Monterey. And then she went on to run one of the run all the sardine program that Fish and Game did here in California. Very, very important. I won't go into a lot later today, or we'll never get done here, but I'm going to do another program in a couple of weeks all about the Fish and Game folks here. And we'll talk a lot about Frances Clark at that time. So here's another one of those fishermen. This is my old friend, Frank Lanaka. Frank Lanaka was a Monterey boy, went to Monterey schools. His family came to Monterey in 1906 to fish salmon. He wanted to be a baseball player. He played baseball for Monterey High School. And then he told me he got to see Joe DiMaggio play baseball at right across the street at Jack's Park. And he said, Joe DiMaggio, son of a fisherman, could be a baseball player. And Frank Lanaka, the son of a fisherman, could be a baseball player. Frank's dad said, no, you're going to be a fisherman. And so he became a sardine fisherman. And this is Frank on his brand new purse seiner, the Ohio number 3. What's important about this is Frank is the first Japanese fisherman in all California to have one of those large sardine boats. He was only 18 years old at that time. And those boats cost about $30,000. As I mentioned, that didn't include the net, which is another $15,000 or so. But Frank, where'd you guys get the money? They weren't a wealthy family. He told me there was this engine company up in San Francisco, Enterprise Engine Company, that just developed a brand new kind of experimental diesel engine. Came down to Monterey, said, anybody willing to put our engine to your boat, we'll carry the note for you. Frank is the only guy that raised his hand. That's how he gets his boat, the Ohio number 3. Here's one of Frank's crew on the deck of his boat, climbing up the net onto that turntable there. And then here's Frank's crew coming in with what we call a deck load of sardines right here. That means they filled the hold, and now they filled the deck of all those sardines. Look at that. He's standing knee deep in sardines right there. So what happens to the sardine? Of course, now the sardine fishery collapses in 1950 for a variety of different reasons. They had plenty of warnings about this collapse coming from the Department of Fish and Game in particular. As early as 1929, they're told they need to cut this fishery down, but no one paid attention at that time. So as the fishery begins to slow down in Monterey Bay, they're going further and further to get sardines. This photograph was taken in Santa Barbara. And there's a fish ladder. The fish are being brought into Santa Barbara, being weighed on these fish ladders, being loaded onto these trucks and trucked up to Monterey. Here they are in the truck being loaded into the Hovden Cannery right here in Monterey. And they are being trucked into the being sucked into the cannery right there, right on the right here on Cannery Row. This wasn't very good. It wasn't very efficient. The fish wouldn't stay that fresh that long from the trip just from Santa Barbara to Monterey. So they had to come up with a new system. So Hovden had this idea. He bought this old troop landing ship from the. These were the big troop landers they used during World War II. If you've ever seen Saving Private Ryan, and when they landed at Normandy, they had these big troop landers. This was a large one that actually brought in tanks and whatnot right onto the beach. And after the war, the United States military was selling these things as surplus. And Hovden bought one and converted it to a floating sardine cannery. And the idea, he'd go out and meet the boats, and then he would begin the process right on this little boat right here. But this, you're looking at it, one and only maiden voyage, only went one time. So this is sort of Monterey's version of the Titanic you see right there. But here's a photograph I took a few years ago. This was taken at the Tuskegee Fish Market in Tokyo, which was then the world's largest fish market. These are not sardines that you find around Japan waters. These are sardines found along the West Coast here, California, Mexico. These are the big sardines. These are fresh sardines right there. Wow. So they still do fish sardines today. But what do? They flash freeze them, and then they ship them to Asia. They ship them to China. They ship them to Vietnam, where they can them, and they ship it back to California, where I took this photograph today in the Safeway out there on Del Monte. You can get California Girl sardines in tomato sauce. Here they are right here. These are probably fished, could be fished right here in Monterey Bay, probably fished in Mexico, but these are the same kind of sardines. I want to harken back to the good old days. I want to give us back to when the sardines were good here in Monterey. We're going to go back to 1940. 1940 was the best year for sardines. If you remember back, I mentioned they took an average 234,000 tons of sardine out of Monterey Bay. For the 1939-1940 season, that was a particularly good season. That was a banner season for these guys. They caught 460,000 pounds of sardines in Monterey Bay. 460,000 pounds of sardines. That was a lot of fish. The sardines were the fishermen were so happy with how much money they made that they decided they wanted to throw this huge party. Everybody in Monterey, the fishermen would celebrate a good season with a fiesta. Townspeople all invited to a party at the waterfront. The boat parade, games, barbecue, dancing. You had to bring your own fork and knife. So here is our festival program. 9:30 is going to be a boat parade. There's going to be skiff races. I love the big barbecue on the new wharf. That's wharf number 2. Dripping hot beef with salad, salami, olive, Swiss cheese, rolls, pickles, and a bottle of beer. Tables and benches will stretch the length of the wharf. And then the water wagon contest, pie eating contest. I love this, the walking grease pole contest, motorcycle races, and street dance. I mean, how much fun is that? Of course, it happened to be the same day, the very same day, that Steinbeck and Ricketts were leaving for their cruise to Baja. Now, I don't know if they had the opportunity to participate in this particular party. I hope they did. But it was quite a send-off for those guys when they left. But I thought it'd be fun. Let's go into our time machine let's go back and see if we can find Mr. Ricketts and Mr. Steinbeck. Maybe they did go to this party right here. Let's see if we can find them. Here, part of those motorcycle races. Look, here is the skip races. You see right there. There they are racing. Ooh, right there. And then you get to the freeze pole. That's my favorite thing right here. Now you wonder why they don't do this kind of thing anymore. Because what they do is they grease that pole up, and the object you have to get across the pole without falling into the water to get that flag right there. Woohoo! And that looks like a lot of fun to me. Yeah. Plus the day's about 55 degrees besides all of that. He said, the heck with he guy. There we go. Then here's the other version of it. You have to shimmy up the pole. Again, now he's got a little rope. He's using it to get to the flag. Very proud. I don't know what they won. I know they had a good time doing it. And then, of course, here we are having that tug of war contest for the kids. And everybody had fun. And of course, it ends with the fireworks. Woo! And a good time was had by all. Thank you. And here I am, by the way. This is about 12 years ago, getting my sardine tattoo right there. So I appreciate y'all. Oh, I did this in an hour. I was surprised. So I appreciate y'all. And if you have any questions, please feel free. Or you can always email me at timsardine@yahoo.com. Thank you.